What's the most body-freezing confession you've heard? Story 1. My mom picked me up so we could get food on my birthday a few years ago and randomly brought up an instance when me and her went to Disney for a cheering competition I was in, where the only thing I asked for on the whole trip aside from food was this round Minnie Mouse plushie filled with those soft styrofoam-like beads. It was so squishy and soft, so I took it to my mom and asked if I could have it. She had said no, so I just assumed parents saying no because they do not want me to have it. She casually drops why I wound up getting it on the last day of the trip. My biological dad and her were still married at the time, and he drained their joint bank account on dancers at a local club. Her friend who was with us, whose daughter was also on the team, had to cover dinner for us that night, and I did not know. She had to call the next morning and ask her job to give her a 3-day advance on her paycheck, as we were not leaving until Saturday morning, so that was going to be like 3.5 days without food for the day, as our stay package only included breakfast at the resort. I already hated my biological dad by this point, and I just could not believe he would be so incredibly reckless. I believed he would do it, but not that he would put me and my mom without food for 3+ days. The awful man. I still have that plushie, by the way, it is in my closet. My biological dad, though, no contact. Story 2. My grandmother married a man almost 20 years younger than herself shortly after my sister and I were born. When we were about 2 years old, our mother went into a psychiatric facility and we were placed in my grandmother's care. About 4 or 5 months after this, my sister got what my grandmother thought was a urinary tract infection, and upon examination it was discovered that she had gonorrhea. Long story short, there is an investigation and my grandmother's husband is arrested. Nearly 2 decades pass, and although my grandmother has divorced this man, she has remained friends with his 2 sisters, the youngest, who is about 15 years, her brother's junior. We are having a 4th of July celebration, and the sisters are in attendance. They are telling my grandmother that her ex has been released from prison and is being housed in a facility for offenders. That is when the oldest sister drops the bombshell. It did not stop him last time, and it will not stop him this time. We all just look at her in shock. What do you mean last time? Apparently, shortly before marrying my grandmother, he had been released from a mental institution after being hospitalized for harming his youngest sister. The entire family knew he was a predator and just kept it to themselves because he had committed his first act when he was still technically a minor 17, and they had hoped the hospitalization had cured him. Then after he reoffended, they literally just did not mention any of this for damn near 2 decades, while simultaneously remaining close friends with my family, which was absolutely devastated by the act. Needless to say, we all cut contact with them. Story 3. In high school, I went to a friend's house to smoke weed. This kid was a little sketchy, but I have known him like my whole life, and we were always good friends. When I got there, 2 guys were there I had never seen before. Well, those guys proceeded to tell us about the night before, where they helped their friend set his house on fire because he killed his grandparents with a machete. They told us how they smoked weed in the house with the dead bodies of his grandparents and his dogs that he killed. This guy that killed his grandparents was on a 3-day meth bender, and his grandpa tried to prevent him from leaving the house, so he got a machete and hacked them up. The guy had videos of him poking his own grandma's eyes with the machete on his phone and other absolutely gruesome stuff. This was in Oklahoma, if anyone is curious. The guy's name is Kyle Smith, and he got life in prison plus 10 years. The 2 weirdos that smoked weed and helped burn the house were also arrested and spent some time in prison. Story 4. I have a family member with dementia, cannot remember names but recognizes faces, has difficulty communicating. I brought some old family photos to have something to talk about, figured she would like seeing them and whatnot. I showed her a photo of her uncle, and she was immediately as lucid and serious as could be. He had abused her sisters, and her older sister had tried to get her to be with him so that the older sister would not have to do it anymore. But she refused to go over there. They lived next door. This created a lifetime of bad blood between her and her older sister. I knew they did not get along, but I never knew why. Her recounting this story clearly and articulately with people's names was unbelievable. I had not heard her so with it for years. I knew Uncle D. We had gone over to his house countless times, and I had fond memories of him. Was this just some crazy story created by her dementia, Or was it real, given how powerfully she remembers it? Story 5. So I used to work nights at a hotel. One week I was scheduled for the latter half and missed that we had been housing a family friend of the general manager. This family friend is an elderly lady, at least early 80s. She comes down to the front desk at midnight looking for a bottle of water and sticks around until about 3 in the morning, just talking general old person, stuff stories, etc. And I am listening and replying nicely since it was an otherwise dead night. Then she drops why she is there. She was deemed not mentally fit to be unsupervised and tried to go out of state with her friends against her husband's, the designated supervisor, permission, so she ran off anyway, leading to cops having to find her, so her kids decided to house her at the hotel for a bit. She then goes on to tell me she hates her husband because of all the trauma he caused their son up to, and including making him work a dangerous logging job that he was severely injured at during his early 20s, and all the associated stories with that. To cap it off, she tells me she is supposed to have medications brought to her, but her kids had not brought them to her yet, and it had been 3 days. She tells me one of the medications is lithium among an assortment of antipsychotics and old person meds. Lady tells me she is on it because she hated him so much she tried to run him over and got institutionalized for a few weeks over it. I feign having to go do some work activities in the back to get out of the conversation, but she asks if she can be swapped rooms due to wanting a better view. But I pass that buck to the manager on the next shift because we do not usually do that for that reason. Flash forward to the next morning, while I am training a new breakfast worker, this lady has a psychotic breakdown and is hanging out in the dining area in only a bath towel. This is an entire other story, but I felt necessary to include. Story 6. Me and 2 friends of mine were on vacation in Amsterdam. We sat in a lounge in a coffee shop and were smoking when a dude came in. He was a very chill guy. He was from the United Kingdom and had moved to the Netherlands a while ago. It was just us 4 in that lounge smoking and having casual conversation. We were talking about motorcycles and stuff like that. Then my friend asked him why he moved to the Netherlands. He started talking and settled into that 2,000-yard stare the more he told us. He had a house in the United Kingdom, and some night a dude broke in while he was at home. He got up, got into a fight with the burglar, and managed to knock him out. He tied him up and called the police. But the police did not show up. He thought they just did not believe him. He called multiple times. At some point, it had been over 1 hour, and the burglar was still tied up in his house. So he threw him out into the garden and poured gasoline over him. He lit a lighter. Then he called the police again, held the phone to the burglar's face, and started screaming, "Help me, he is going to kill me. He is going to burn me alive." Then police arrived. They arrested them both, and both were sent to prison. After he was released, he started a new life in the Netherlands, and you could tell that story was real by the look on his face and how silent everything became when he started talking. We were just sitting in silence for a minute after he told us that story, and he just stared at the wall saying nothing. Afterwards, he snapped back, and we had a somewhat normal conversation again. But not going to lie, we were nervous as anything when he told us that story. Story 7. We were standing around at work with maybe 5 or 6 people, all taking turns making jokes and telling stories. Boss was also hanging out with us. One of the newer guys starts telling a story with a vibe like, "We are all going to get a kick out of this." Basically, him and his cousin went to party and try to sleep with a couple girls. They split off into couples. His cousin got rejected by the girl and got mad, and went home leaving him there. He woke up drunk and saw his cousin was gone. Apparently he freaked out thinking something shady was happening. He pulled out a knife and demanded the girls' phones. He kept asking what they did with his cousin, thinking they had either hurt him or had someone else hurt him. He kept them there demanding answers and terrifying these girls. Eventually his cousin calls him back and says he got mad his girl would not be with him, so he went home. The dude gave their phones back and sat around their apartment until his cousin came back to pick him up. Everyone is just staring at him. Jaws dropped. My boss walked away halfway through the story, so he did not have to be a part of that conversation. I said I would probably never tell that story again if I were you. I have a daughter and I dread that her just trying to have fun one night leads her into crossing paths with dudes like that. He had no thoughts or care into how much he must have scared those girls. He thought it was a funny story about a misunderstanding and how his cousin got rejected. Story 8. There was this dude I hung out with once in a while for maybe 6 months before we just fell off each other's radar. My wife and I got along with him and his family fine. We just did not mesh into friendship very well. A few years later, he shows up just looking to talk to a friendly face. I have had bad times before, so I invite him in and ask how he has been. Turns out he is stressed out because his wife had an injury and told him to find romance elsewhere to unwind. The injury was unusual, but they were swingers. He thought it was a good idea to text his 12-year-old stepdaughter and her 13-year-old friend about it. He lays it all out like he did it from his point of view, and at the end drops the one sentence I told her she could not buy a new movie, so she stole my phone and sent all these texts to her and her friends' phones to get back at me. Then he says he is taking the plea deal and going to jail for 5 years. We do not say anything remotely supportive, and he just leaves. So now he is on a registry for life, because even he did not believe it when he said his stepdaughter set him up. We moved before he got out 5 years later. It was not the only reason, but started the maybe we should not live here in 5 years talk. Story 9. One day out of nowhere, my dad explained about the last time he saw his father. His father was apparently an alcoholic, abusive man who would hurt my dad, uncle, and grandmother after a hard night's drinking. One night, my dad and uncle had had enough and waited up for their father to get home. As soon as my granddad walked through the door, my uncle threw a heavy raincoat over his head and then beat him with my father until he was not moving anymore. Dad had said he was beating on him for about 10 minutes after my uncle had said he had gone limp and then just snapped out of it. The two of them then dragged him into the street in the middle of the night and never saw him again. My dad had blurted this out to me while we were out driving on an errand, before explaining, "You're about to meet your great uncle, my uncle, who I have not seen or spoken to for decades. He knows where your grandfather is." We get to this house and meet my great uncle, have a catching up chat before he told my dad that my grandfather had recently died alone of cancer in a local hospital. Even though my great uncle had had a way to contact my dad, the reverse of how my dad found my uncle, he never reached out to my dad and offered no explanation as to why, and would not explain what my grandfather's life had been like all these years, apart from telling my dad he remained an alcoholic. That was the most I have ever found out about my own family before or since, which was a lot to take on for an 11-year-old. Years later, it would occur to me that my dad lost both his father and his brother under the same circumstances. He had beaten both of them before they had stopped speaking, and both of them had died of cancer as alcoholics. Story 10. Used to work in a really awful warehouse, the type of place that hired anybody. Anyways, one day we get a new hire that I will call Bill. He was very bug-eyed, like there was something wrong, but I could not put my finger on it. But talking with him, you would not know because he seemed very intelligent and friendly. Anyways, he always wore really baggy jeans, and one day he had an itch on his leg, and he lifted his pants leg to scratch, and I noticed an ankle monitor on his leg. I was confused because I thought they did background checks there, but later was when I learned that the company worked hand in hand with the prison system to hire people that are looking for jobs in halfway houses. Bill was someone that had served time in prison for over 10 years. He told me this but never said anything about his crime that he committed, was always secretive of that. Eventually rumors came around and people said that Bill was in prison for harming a woman. Well, curiosity got the best of me, and I Googled him, and it was no woman, it was a 16-year-old girl he harmed. I kept this to myself, but now I saw him so differently. Then one day Bill tells me something that was a bit disturbing. He told me that he was riding his bike to Walmart and that he saw a pretty woman and that he began to feel funny and that this made him panic and leave on his bike so he would not act out on impulse. I did not know what to say when he said this to me, just nodded and said, "Oh, wow." Story 11. My grandfather, he was crying randomly one day in the dining room. I asked him what was wrong. He said nothing was wrong. He is just remembering the little Italian boy that saved his life. My grandfather was a paratrooper in the French Foreign Legion, 3REP. He was stationed in Algeria during the conflict and saw a lot of conflict there. This story was chilling. They were on patrol and my grandfather was point man. He was relatively new. The Italian came up alongside him and told him to stop and survey their surroundings. The area was a prime area for an ambush. My grandfather said he surveyed the area in front of him when the Italian shouted, "Get down," shoved him to the ground, and fired a burst directly to their right. The return fire was immediate, and the Italian dropped like dead weight. My grandfather's unit took cover and returned fire. He dragged the Italian to cover and started tending to his wounds, calling for the medic. He was hit in the abdomen and bleeding profusely. They got him patched up, but the medic said he is going to make it, but needs to get to the hospital as soon as possible. The fight lasted for a while, but gradually the firing slowly stopped. It appeared the Algerians had pulled away. The leader of the unit called for a helicopter to evacuate the wounded, which there was only one, the Italian. It arrived. They got him on a stretcher and loaded up into the helicopter. The Algerians did not leave. They were waiting. They started firing again, straight at the helicopter. The pilot apparently tried to gain altitude quickly and banked to the right to avoid the fire. My grandfather watched the stretcher slide right out, the Italian fall out of the stretcher and fall straight to the ground. He said he hit the ground with a loud thud, with dust coming up on impact. He was wide out in the open, so nobody could get to him, despite trying. The pilot took off. This time, my grandfather's unit did not wait for the firing to subside. They were angry and they went after them. And he said the fight did not stop until they were 100% sure there would not be another ambush. Easy to guess what that means. When they were 100% sure, he ran to the Italian who had died from the impact. My grandfather saw a lot of terrible things, but this is the one that stood out for him the most. A man died who saved his life. The amount of blood he saw, which he blamed himself for, affected him right up until the last day of his life. He could not even see a small cut with blood without getting physically ill. And it was the first time he took the life of another human being out of anger. That was the only story he told about his time in Algeria, because he said it was the worst day of his life. Story 12. I was 16 and out having a bonfire party with some new friends I had met on a short course. We were drinking cider and playing Never Have I Ever. This one guy goes, "Never have I ever killed someone." He drank. We were all shocked and someone bravely asked what happened. He went on to talk about how back home he had been part of a gang, and that had been the initiation task and that we were not allowed to tell anyone. He did not explicitly threaten anyone, but it was certainly implied. As he was from a different country and had a very common name, there was no way for us to do anything about it. This is not quite a confession, but certainly a body-freezing moment for me. I was out on a road trip with my parents when I was 16, and we were on our way to visit a village in the mountains when my dad stopped to pick up a hitchhiker. My dad loved to talk to people, and he was no small guy, so safety was not really a concern typically. Pretty much immediately, something about this guy we picked up feels off. We tell him where we are off to, and he starts talking about how he is a police officer and has been investigating in that village, as there have been plenty of assaults committed there, and turns to me with this massive grin on his face, saying that I need to be careful when I go up there, or I might really need to work for my money. I froze and just laughed it off. We very quickly dropped this guy off and pretended it never happened. For some reason, that stays with me 10 plus years later. Story 13. I have one fun one and one scary one. Starting with scary, I worked at a restaurant with a dude and became close friends with him, often going out drinking and smoking, hanging out till late. He had always told me stories about his childhood and how he was abused physically by his dad and bullied in school hard because he had a slight lisp. One night after a late close and plenty of drinking, we were walking back to his place to smoke and play some Mortal Kombat when he casually tells me that he used to kill cats when he was a kid and teenager, that he killed them many different ways, setting one on fire, tying one to a rock, and throwing it in a pond, literally so many ways he did it. The worst was how he described how a cat struggles as you skin it alive, and that they live longer than you would think, said, with a slight chuckle to his voice. The second is far more fun in my opinion. My wife's grandmother was a very eccentric woman who lived in a massive house with no furniture. Except for a bed on the floor, all her time went to her art, which was everywhere. She lived in Alabama after World War II. After the war, she was employed in the Women Air Force service pilots, and while she did not fly, she did monitor radars and told us casually over dinner one evening that she had been sworn not to divulge information, but their main job was to track unidentified flying object activity over the Gulf of Mexico. She said she tracked 12 personally, but knows the team tracked way more than that. Story 14. My grandma once casually told me about the time my mom wanted to kill my grandfather. We were just doing the dishes together, and she started randomly talking about how she is actually glad her ex-husband died, and she is tired of pretending to be sad about it. She started talking about how he was a drunkard and abused her, and my mom knew that part, overheard people talk about it many times. But then she told me about the time he came home drunk one night, started tugging her around the room while my mom was crying. Then he grabbed something and threw it, shattering the window. He took some money from home. They used to hide it from him, but he found it and started heading back out. Allegedly, at that moment, my mom grabbed a piece of shattered glass and started running at him, screaming that she is going to slit his throat. Do not know if she actually would have. My grandma had to hold her down until she calmed down. And after telling me about this story, my grandma casually went on to talk about good old days and how much better it used to be while I was having an existential crisis over the fact that I used to love my grandfather as a little boy. I thought he was such a nice man when I was younger. Story 15. I had a friend, let us call him Bill, back in my youth, who sold narcotics. At around 13 or so years old, we were hanging out one day when he stopped to make a deal. The deal went south. They stole the weed and started a chase with them. We ended up cornering the guys into their house. They came out with knives, so we left. Bill was incredibly pissed off and talked about revenge, but he eventually calmed down, and I heard nothing of it after. Fast forward maybe 7 years later, I run into Bill now. Really an acquaintance at a party. We talk and catch up, and at the end of the party, I offer him a ride home since I was sober. Him and a couple of the guys I came with are in the car talking about the old days. Bill is drunk and shifts tone and says, "Hey man, remember back in the day those guys who stole from me and we chased them?" I said, "Yeah, I do, but have not thought about that in ages. I do not think I even remember their names." Bill says, "And I will never forget this well. I never told you this at the time, but I had them killed. I have never felt so uncomfortable in my life. I wish he had never told me. Part of me thinks he is making it up though." Bill did used to have gang connections, but he also had a tendency to exaggerate details to make stories better. Something kind of felt like he was not kidding though. Story 16. My grandparents casually slipped in a story about nearly giving my dad up for adoption. My dad definitely had no idea and was pretty shocked when I told him. After some time, he was able to reflect and said that some of his life events now made sense. The story is not nearly as bad as it sounds, but for some context, my grandparents were non-Jewish German citizens. They were both from pretty normal to upper-class German families during World War II. No one in their family was directly involved in the war effort. They were also too young to be involved in the youth movement, probably about 10 years old. They met after the war and got married and had 2 kids. My dad was the third born. My grandmother's sister was not able to have kids and propositioned my grandmother to adopt her third child, my dad. Apparently, it was pretty close to happening, and my grandma backed out of it because she just could not do it. They eventually had my dad and immigrated to the United States legally. My dad's family basically uprooted and came over to the United States to escape post-World War II life. My grandparents eventually had 6 boys in total. The stuff my dad came to realize was how different he was treated by his aunt. For birthdays, he would get extra special presents. She would give him extra attention. She just had more favor for him compared to his 5 brothers. He now is realizing it was because he was close to being adopted by her. It was pretty funny, but I could see how much it blew his mind. This was all dropped during some casual conversation while on a weekend trip that I just so happened to visit my grandparents on a whim. Grandpa liked his Busch beer and would apparently drop the gossip over a few cold ones. They also dropped some other pretty big stories that day. I guess they were getting older and wanted to share. I think my grandpa was about 88 at the time. He passed away 2 years ago at 93. My wife and I sometimes reminisce about that day and the things we heard. People who lived through World War II have some stories. Story 17. I always tell this story really simply, but this is what happened. I was around 11 when I was sitting in the car, and abortions came on the radio, something about pro-choice versus pro-life. I told my mom that I could never get an abortion. I believe all life is valuable. At this point, I had been tortured and abused by her, had an emergency night removal by Child Protective Services, with her been homeless with her, and many more awful experiences. Not a lot left me speechless, but she just looked forward expressionless and said I was going to get an abortion with you. I wanted to. I turned to look at her and she just sat there. Then she kept going, maybe I asked her what or something, and basically told me this. My biological dad, who she met in recovery, denied me, and she moved back home states away. She told me that she got back together with a really abusive ex and planned to abort me. She had already had one before. This also shocked me. Then she said this part. He was hurting her every day trying to get her to miscarry. He pushed her down the stairs, hurt her stomach with different objects and whatever else. She said at some point she was alone at night and something spoke to her. She believes it was God. He told her she had to have this baby and that this baby was created for something. From that point, she said she knew she could not have an abortion with me. She stopped using drugs and fled back upstates to get with my biological dad again, which is when me and my stepdad came in. That is the day I became pro-choice, though. My mom could have saved me from so much pain and hurt she was causing me on purpose and changed her mind. I did not say anything for a long time, and it really made me hate myself for different reasons. My mom lived an awful life. Everything she did to me and my brother, her and her siblings, got 25 times worse. So she often had stories that left me speechless. She did not speak a lot about what her life was like before foster care. I feel for her. She gave me the same type of start her parents gave her. I just got opportunities to make better decisions. Just crazy to hear that at 11 years old. Story 18. My ex-boyfriend would randomly tell me really dark things with little to no warning when we were together. It was a toxic and abusive relationship, which is why these things would be said and the relationship continued. I was very concerned for him. He scared me quite a lot. Examples he told me about how he would hit or kick his dog. He also kicked me a couple of times in front of people too. He told me that he has dacrophilia, can get aroused when people cry, and would be angered by me asking if it applied to me. I am sure it must have sometimes, but he insisted that it did not, and it was when someone he disliked or hated cried. He told me unprompted that he had seen a video on Reddit of a young woman being beaten up by a group of men, and that it turned him on. He would repeatedly tell me about his dark and unsettling dreams, and talk about wanting to or fantasizing about hurting or killing people. I once actually said to him towards the end of our relationship that I think that if he ever were to actually act on it, I knew it would be me. He responded with a very casual, nonchalant, no. Not the most convincing response. That he has these people or things that have been there since he was very young that exist in his mind. They had names, different personalities. He would even draw them sometimes. According to him, some of them liked me and some of them did not. There was one female one, and I found out that I apparently looked quite a bit like her. I could go on, but this is honestly the most I have said publicly about it, and it is just very exposing and scary. So yeah, for anyone out there who is trapped in a relationship with someone that scares, hurts, disrespects, etc., them, I know what you're going through. Story 19. I was afraid of flying as a teenager, so my parents let me take a bus from San Francisco to Salt Lake City to visit my grandparents. It left late, so we went through Nevada, and hitting a bunch of small casino towns just as dawn hit was a surreal and strangely beautiful experience. Anyway, one of the stops picked up this older hippie dude. He got on and sat with these two wannabe gangster teens near me. They got to talking, and it turns out they all had prison stories. The teens were in for petty teenage things, but the hippie did real time for beating a guy into a coma. He told the story with such derision and dismissiveness, like being locked up was some bit of misfortune that happened to him, rather than the consequences of his own actions. So of course the other teens had shut up by this point because it was clear the hippie was on a whole different level of crime than they were. But the guy kept on talking, and he said that his sentence got extended because his victim died from his injuries while the hippie was still in prison. The way the hippie spoke made it sound like the guy who died did it to spite him. The whole story had just an "aw shucks man, look at my bad luck" vibe to it. The rest of the bus ride was really quiet after that. Story 20. I did a year of my training as a clinical psychologist in a forensic psychiatric hospital. The kind of institution where people end up after they have pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity or after they have been found unfit to stand trial. One of my tasks was sitting down one-on-one with patients and obtaining an updated assessment of their understanding of the crime that they had been charged with. This entailed interviewing them for about an hour, about every detail of what happened, exploring their understanding of their mindset at the time, getting a sense of their current mindset and of their current attitude towards what they had been accused of. I then had to write up a report that was presented to the course and also used in the refinement of their treatment plan in the hospital. I did this with people who have been charged with assault rape of both adults and children murder, and even cannibalism. I did about 50 of these over the course of a year, so as you can imagine, I heard some pretty serious confessions. I have not read through these other responses yet, but I bet not many people have heard someone confess to eating a loved one. Story 21, not exactly a confession, but it was extremely jarring, and it came up with absolutely zero provocation. At my first professional job, I had a coworker I will call Jane. To give a bit of background, Jane was a rather small, quiet woman, likely in her late 30s, although possibly older, as her hair was already graying at the edges. In all honesty, she kind of reminded me of Velma from the old Scooby-Doo version I watched as a child, but with much longer hair. Anyway, as I said, Jane was very quiet, and we had little to no interactions. The only time we ever spoke was when she happened to be at the copy machine at the same time I was. She would say hello or good day, and I would return the greeting, and we would move on with our day. One day I was at the machine at the same time she was, and we exchanged our usual greeting. A few moments later, Jane slowly began talking about how stressful a week it had been. It was a kind of one-sided conversation, but she addressed it to me, so I kind of nodded along. At first, she mentioned pretty ordinary stressors, deadlines at work, issues with her kids, misbehaving, etc., then out of nowhere. And with the same matter-of-fact tone, she mentioned how just last night, she had been in the car with her husband when arguing, and he had just snapped. He drove off the road and into the surrounding woods before coming to a halt. He then pulled out his handgun from where he kept it in the glove box and deactivated the safety before putting it to her head. He then proceeded to alternate between rambling about how tired he was of her and asking her if arguing with him was worth her life. I distinctly recall one of the things he mused over was how well their kids would fare with him in prison and her dead. Then when it was over, he put the gun away and drove back onto the road like nothing had happened, and their night went on, I guess. I was so shocked that I did not even know how to react. I was only 26 at the time, and this was something so outside my life experiences up to that point. Either way, she just walked off, leaving me completely disturbed. Looking back, I am almost positive she did not really want a response. She was just processing what had happened and was using me as a sounding board. But I recall being disturbed for a long time afterwards until I eventually moved on. Considering that this was back in 2017, it has been years since I thought of that, but this question made it surface again. Story 22. I was raised in a Christian conservative home where you would be kicked out and disowned for confessing to same-sex attraction. My parents always used words like disgusting, sinful, shameful, abomination when referring to anyone who was open about their same-sex attraction, whether it was in public or television or an old friend online. This was extremely difficult for me as a bisexual woman. I had to keep a huge part of myself secret, so secret that I did not even accept it until I was married to my husband. And he pointed it out and continued to love and accept me. We are both Christians, just not the same kind my parents are. Anyway, imagine my surprise, my anger when my mom randomly confesses to me that she does not find men physically attractive. They do nothing for her. But boobs, she says casually, those will turn me on like that. She snaps her fingers. I say nothing because my mother would not be able to handle the full scope of her confession. She would wither away to know that the entire 37 years she has been married to my dad, never desiring sex and only finding other women sexually attractive, is because she is a closeted lesbian. But I have kept this information in my back pocket should the need to reveal her own secret to her ever arise. Story 23. Back in 2015, I was 20. I went to the bank on a Saturday morning. This branch only has the drive-thru open on Saturdays. There was an old lady standing in the drive-thru between my car and another car. She approached me and asked if she could sit in my car because the tellers would not help her if she was not in a vehicle. Being naive, I said sure. We were talking about little things like the weather and local things going on when she dropped one of the creepiest things I have heard in person. She said her husband had passed away a few years ago and that she kept his body in her living room, not ashes or an urn, but his body. She said she liked looking at him and would change his clothes often. I have no idea if that is legal. It probably is not. I do not know how he died or if she had anything to do with it. I did not want to get any more involved or possibly end up like him. I just wanted her out of my car without making a scene. Thankfully, the car ahead of me moved and it was our turn. When she was done with her transaction, she thankfully left my car. I was too shocked and stupid to mention it to the teller. I will never let someone I do not know inside my car again, no matter how much they look like a kind, harmless stereotype. Story 24. My ex-husband's best mate was a plumber, and he unblocked a toilet that destroyed a marriage. So the wife and husband were home, and he started the job by asking, "Do you put anything down the toilet?" He told them, "It is easier to remove things if I know what they are. And trust me, I have seen it all." He rattles off the list: tampons, pads, tissues, towelettes, paper towel, full nappies, gloves, condoms. They both look at him and say, "Nope, absolutely not." So he gets to work unblocking it. This whole time, the wife was chatting away just behind him, and the husband was just floating around in the background. Nothing out of the ordinary, just a typical job. So the blockage works its way loose, and all these condoms come floating up out of the toilet. The husband comes back to see all of them being pulled from the toilet and looks with absolute anger and hurt in his eyes, but remains quiet. The wife is like, "Thanks for that," all the while just ignoring all the condoms. Our mate said you could cut the tension with a knife. The husband eventually looks at him and states, "Those are not mine, mate. I had a vasectomy years ago." Our friend then explains if they are renting or new homeowners, these things can happen from previous owners. The guy was like, "Nope, we own this place and built it together before our kids were born." Our friend said he did not even charge them. He just wanted to get out of there. I remember him saying that he usually checks further down the line as well, because that is usually a bigger issue. But he laughed and said, "I was not going back though." Story 25. One time when I was about 11, my family went out to the desert to shoot some guns my uncle and grandpa had bought. My grandpa was a firearms instructor for 40 years, so we always had a fun and safe time. After about an hour of standing out in the sun, my cousin and I got bored, so we decided to play in the back of my grandpa's truck. It had one of those covers for the truck bed. It was nice and shady. By play, I mean, we dug around in some old boxes that we should not have and looked at all the little trinkets we could find. I remember we found this very old-looking wooden box buried at the bottom of a black garbage bag. We opened the box and found a very old-looking dog collar that was broken at the latch. Did not think much of it and left the wooden box on the floor with the other stuff we found. After a couple minutes of this, our grandpa came back to the truck and saw that we found the dog collar. He asked us if he ever told us why he became a firearms instructor, to which we said no. The story he told us has been burned into our minds since the day we heard it. He told us that when he was 16 years old, him and his uncle had driven out to the Tonto National Forest during hunting season. My grandpa was not a good shot back then, so he mostly tagged along to get out of the house when his friends were elsewhere. They had stayed out much later than they should have and were lost down by a stream at dusk. While they were trying to find the clearing, they had parked their truck at their hunting dogs became very anxious, sitting completely still with their tails between their legs, refusing to move any further. His uncle started getting anxious too, because the dogs had never been scared like this before. At some point, he and his uncle could hear something across the stream making noises, but they could not really tell what it was. After about a minute of confused silence, they heard clear as day, a woman calling out, "Here, boy," and patting her legs repeatedly. One of the hunting dogs, still anxious, began crossing the stream. The thing was, it was nearly pitch black in the woods by this point, and the area they heard this woman calling was all the way up a steep hill on the other side of the stream. The dog was climbing up the side of the hill between the trees following her voice. His uncle tried crossing the stream after the dog and shouted for the woman to knock it off because She was startling the dogs, but she continued. His uncle stopped about halfway across the stream and fired a warning shot in the air and said if she did not stop, he would shoot her. My grandpa said what happened next is exactly why he decided to get better with guns. Apparently, his uncle could not see all the way up the hill from his position on the riverbank, but my grandpa could see it clearly in the moonlight. He said there was a woman standing still on the hilltop next to a tree. Once his dog had reached the woman, she grabbed him by the collar and with one hand smashed the dog to death against the trunk of the tree. His exact words were the first swing paralyzed him, the second swing killed him, and the third swing broke him free from the collar. The dog fell down the hill and into the stream in front of his uncle. My grandpa raised his rifle and shot at the woman until he could not see her standing on the hill, though he did not think any of the shots hit her. He saw something fall from the sky and splash in the water in front of him, and saw the broken collar floating in the water. Him and his uncle carried the dog and the collar until they found his truck. They drove out of there, and to this day, my grandfather has never hunted in the Tonto National Forest since. My cousin and I promptly have not dug around in any old family boxes since. However, I have asked my mom about it, and apparently it is something he tells everyone in the family at least once, so we are not the only ones who have heard the story. It is the only scary story he has ever told, apparently. Story 26. An uncle of mine in the 1960s as a child mine. You basically help smuggle guns. 1960s Ireland, by the way, very fun times. He did not know he was doing it. He used to collect parcels at the port for an older guy in town and deliver them to him on his bike for a little extra pocket change. Did it once or twice a week and was pretty happy with himself. One day he is cycling to the fella's house when he falls off his bike and a box tears open a bit on the ground, so he looks inside, and to him at the time it just looked like a load of metal wood springs and screws. Thought nothing of it and continued on to deliver the box. He was not asked to collect any more parcels. After that, he suspects the guy did not trust him anymore. A decade or so later, he barely remembers anything about it and brings it up with my Nana, who eventually tells him that the guy he gave the parcels to ran off after a shed of his was found to be full of rifles, and he was thought to have ties to the IRA. When I was younger, my uncle just loved sharing that little story. Anytime the family had a get-together and drink was involved, we would hear it again. He has been a lot less willing to talk about it recently, though, and I kind of wish I had pressed him for more details at the time. Story 27. My grandfather told me the story of how he had let his romantic rival drown so that my grandmother would only have him as a suitor. It was more of a brag than a confession and apparently a well-known story in our family. The way Gramps told it, he had seen the other guy slip on a muddy riverbank and then grab hold of a fallen tree branch that was sticking in the water. My grandfather said he could have just grabbed hold of the end of the branch and hauled the other guy in, but instead he just stood there and watched until the guy lost his grip and was washed away. The absolutely scariest part about this story was that it was verifiably true. When I was in my late teens, I was in the town where this happened visiting family and decided to see if there was any mention of it in the local papers. The library had a full set of microfiche for the largest one, and I was able to find the article where my grandfather was quoted as saying there was not anything anyone could do other than watch. Story 28. My mom almost did not exist. My grandfather served in World War II in a type of tank he called a half-track. My entire life I can remember my grandfather saying maybe 2 or 3 sentences to us each visit. We always said that Grandma talked enough for both of them. When Grandma had a heart attack and stroke and ended up in the hospital, my sister and I went down to help clean out the house and finally moved them into assisted living. He was not happy about it. While we were there, Grandma was recovering in hospice and had another heart attack, and they took her back to the hospital, so my sister and I got Grandpa and drove him over. Because of COVID on the decline at that point, the hospital would not let him visit her until she was settled in a room. He refused to leave without seeing her, so we just sat in the car to wait. I will never forget the hours we sat in that car. I remember hardly breathing for fear that Grandpa would stop talking. He told us about the wars he served in Vietnam, Korea, and World War II. He told us about the war games he helped design for Vietnam and Korea. But then he told us about Germany. He could not remember the name of the village, but his half-track got hit, and he got injured pretty bad, so they radioed it into the Allies and left him in a bakery in the village to be picked up by the next group of medics. Our family name was on his uniform, of course, and it is a traditionally Jewish name, so when the people in the village saw his name on the uniform, they started beating him. He told us how he felt himself slipping away, and he started praying in Latin. My grandfather is a very devout Catholic and knew a lot of Latin. He was repeating the Lord's Prayer in Latin as they beat him till someone heard him and stopped them. They asked him in broken English, "Are you Catholic?" He could only whisper yes and try to nod his head, not sure what they would do. They all stopped. Left him alone on that bakery floor, bleeding and broken, until a unit came in and picked him up. I just remember looking at my sister while Grandpa kept telling us stories and trying to say we should be recording this. It is the most I have ever heard him talk in my entire life. He went on to tell us stories about his sweetheart and how much he loved Grandma. He is declining pretty quickly now and only gets up to go and visit his sweetheart when he can, even if Grandma mostly sleeps and does not remember who any of us are anymore. I would give anything in the world to go back in time to that night in the car and record those stories of the war, his service, and how much he loves my grandma. He has compiled a lot of his own writing and research over the years on our family and his own story. He shared the binders with me when I was last there. I am a researcher, so he told me he wants me to write his story someday. I promised I would, and I hope I can do him justice and tell the story of how much he loved his sweetheart and served his adopted country as a first-generation immigrant. Story 29. When I was in the Army, we had an NCO that was the sweetest person you would ever want to meet. He never cursed, never yelled, and was like the kind dad next door, a real Mr. Rogers type, but in camo and carried a Bowie knife. Anyway, we got to the part in our training where you are conditioned to take a human life under certain circumstances, and he used the book Black Hearts as an example. He mentioned the murders, the assaults, and the torture that took place, and how if you are not careful, you can lose your soul in war. His eyes got all distant, and his face went blank for a moment, then he bounced back to his old self. A few weeks later, he mentioned offhand being in the unit in the book around the time of those events, but he never confirmed or denied being present for the crimes committed. I just remember reading the book and getting chills anytime he was around after that, because either he memorized those specific passages and then some, or he was speaking from experience not mentioned there. It was like looking into the eyes of a shark that could feel remorse. Story 30. I am from a small town, but for a year of middle school and 2 of high school, I went to an even smaller school. 1 town over, because my parents thought there would be less bad kids or bad things for me to get into in the tiny town school. My first year there was rough. I did not know a soul. I made friends the first week with a somewhat popular kid that was the only other kid who would wear metal band shirts and JNCOs, like I was at the time, instead of Wranglers. About 6 weeks into 8th grade, I started going out with this popular girl who was best friends with my newfound best friend's longtime girlfriend. The 4 of us go to the movies to see Forrest Gump, and during the scene where Jenny and Forrest are hiding from her drunk dad, it seems to make my buddy uncomfortable, and he and his girlfriend get up and walk out, but he makes some comment about trying to bum a cigarette from someone outside or something. My date turns and begins to tell me that my buddy's parents had split for a time 2 years ago, and that his little sister had gone with his mom, and he had stayed with his dad, who he still lived with, and I had met quiet, serious, typical cowboy type that was a night supervisor at the local huge distribution center in the town over. She goes on to say that the mom had run off with a coworker, and that just a few months in the coworker had done some brutal assault stuff to his sister. She was 2 grades below us. I guess his mom and sister came back when the mom found out cops were involved. Supposedly the mom's coworker was arrested. I had no idea. So fast forward a few weeks, and I am staying over at his house, as I often did, because his dad worked nights, and we could play music loud and sneak cigarettes and try to get girls to come over and typical stuff. But we end up talking about his sister because he cannot find his jacket or something and thought she took it. I ask him about what happened to his mom's coworker. He basically acts like it is no big deal, says yeah, he is in prison for like 15 years. I asked him if his mom went back with him because we all around school knew his mom had taken off again and this time left the sister. He says no, she is not with anyone. Okay, weird. So the next day we are riding on his four-wheeler along the fence line of his dad's property, as some part of that was his chores. As we are going, he starts telling me where he has buried coyotes, that he has shot common, they eat chickens and will kill your pets, etc. There, by that tree, by that big rock. And then in absolute matter of fact, without slowing the pace on the four-wheeler he is driving, and I am on the back of, he points to a tree with a large rock next to it and says that is where my mom is buried, and keeps on driving. Story 31. You need some context first. So I am adopted. My biological grandmother and her husband, who I am not blood related to, adopted me, and I was raised to think my biological mom was my half-sister. I found out about the adoption by accident at age 20. Some paperwork my mom needed to do for her job included names of everyone she had lived with, and I was there with a different name, and there was a man listed I had never heard of before. After that, my dad was more open about the entire thing, but one time we were riding in the car somewhere. Mom had been her usual abusive self that day, and we were both resentful about that, and Dad said that he wished he had left her before they found out about my birth. He had been thinking of leaving her and just being single, but he had been sticking it out for whatever reason, and then I was born, they found out, discovered the neglect I was experiencing, and had to marry to be able to adopt me. And he hated every minute of his life since then. It is a nice mind twist to find out your dad blames you for his life of unhappiness. Really do not recommend. Especially fun because I remember growing up screaming at them in desperation after any one of their fights that I wanted them to get a divorce so they would be happy. Begging them to just separate already. I would have been happier if they were not together. And yet Dad blames me for the relationship. Story 32. I have so many. When I was 13, I was in the mental hospital where I met a poor girl that was talking about how when she was little, maybe 9 or so, she was at home with her dad when he decided to end his life by shooting himself in the head. She did not know what the noise was and went to check and found her dad dead. She called emergency services and then tried to hold his head together and put his brains back in. She did not say this during group, but during an activity, which is why it was more surprising to hear, since a lot of girls save stuff like that for group or one-on-one conversations with one of the other girls. In that same visit, there was a 6-ish-year-old on our ward who was there because she tried to burn down her house because she did not want to play house with her cousin anymore and had other strong indicators of being sexually abused. She did not seem to understand why she was in there, but was like the little sister of the ward and went along with just about everything so casually. She was a very sweet little girl. I knew a girl that was a trafficking victim and one day told us that she was a recruiter and she would go around her neighborhood school malls and talk to the girls her trafficker pointed out to her. She was very casual about it, but you could tell she felt awful about it and truly did not know what was happening was bad or abnormal. I also knew 2 other trafficking victims who were on the streets together, escaped from the sister facility of the one we were in together, and went back to their traffickers. Story 33. There was a kid in the group of people I hung out with in high school that always had everyone at his house either to just hang out after school on the weekdays or parties on weekends. His parents were pretty cool and let us do just about whatever we wanted. Some people were genuinely friends with him, but for most of us, it was a place to hang out and do whatever. I did not mind him, we were sort of friends. But he could be an odd dude, he was not a total creep. But he was awkward and weird enough that it was uncomfortable if it was just you and him, or whoever was the person to show up at his house before anyone else. Some of us would tell girls to make sure other people were there before they went over, not that he would do anything, but it was more so that he did not scare the girls away. Anyways, my girlfriend and him were driving back from a party at another friend's house, and out of nowhere, he started talking about how him and another one of our dude friends had intercourse the night before. He said they got a bunch of booze, and the girls they invited over never showed, and they were together instead. We absolutely thought he was joking, and we were laughing and making jokes. And then he started crying and getting almost mad. I remember him grabbing my shoulder while I was driving as he was sobbing, saying how much he hated himself for it. For the rest of the ride back, only a 10-minute drive, we told him it is no big deal, things like that happen, and that we obviously would not say anything to anyone, and told him if it did keep bothering him, that I would talk to him if he ever felt like he needed to. It was just out of nowhere. We were all having a blast and even the short ride home having fun. Then he just dropped that on us. It was crazy. Story 34. My cousin told me that he was wanting to get a job so he could move out of his mom's house and go no contact because he thought she was starting to lose her mind. His mom has fully supported him his entire life, including the past 10 years since he graduated high school, as well as buying him a brand new Honda Fit that he subsequently beat up. He has taken a phenomenal amount of advantage of his mother, and now when he thinks she might start needing some assistance from him, he is trying to figure out how to abandon her. He told me this a couple of years ago. I was so appalled by it that, coupled with some other actions he made that negatively impacted me directly, I have not spoken to him since. We left on good terms. He once hit me up to tell me to let him know. When I was back in town, I simply have not. I am still friends with him on Steam and see his play hours. He usually has 90 to 130 plus hours of playtime logged on Steam alone, mostly War Thunder, with a total playtime of over 4,500. He never did get a job. He never did move out. I almost feel sorry for his mother, but he is exactly what she raised. Story 35. I worked with a kid that emigrated from South Africa. I honestly forget the country. We used to ask him all the time about the differences between the United States and where he grew up. Seemed to be a nice place until I asked him why they moved here and why they picked a dangerous city. He said his mom and sister came here because the worst that happens is you forget to lock your door and all your stuff is missing. I pressed him a little bit and he told me back where he grew up they had a decent house that was fortified and they even had armed guards. That still did not stop his mom and sister, around 12 at the time, from being assaulted and his dad and brother killed. He mentioned in a 5-year span they hired around 10 different guards. They either went to someone who offered more money or died guarding the house. He was cheerful when he spoke, telling me how when they came here and his mom's car got stolen, that is all they did. They stole the car, but did not kill anyone. That was about 15 years ago. His family has moved to a better area. Him and his sister are both married with kids and living the dream. Story 36. Guy I was friends with for a couple months noticed he had a drinking problem and would shake when he had not had a drink, had a poor me type of mindset for everything, and was always this victim and everyone was against him. I thought it was weird, and he was going through some stuff, claimed he had post-traumatic stress, and when he got drunk and tried to strangle and assault me in his apartment, he admitted that he assaulted his little sister when she was 9 years old and he was 18, but he was just experimenting because he did not know what to do with his thing. That is why nobody in his family will talk to him the last 11 years, and the only relative he had was his grandma who died recently. All of a sudden, everything made sense to me. He was in a pretty bad accident with less than 10% chance of survival. He spent 4 months in hospital, and I visited him daily regardless of how I felt or the weather, and this time I was dealing with organ failure. He never had anyone except me visit him. Even the medical team were running questions and everything by me and had me as his next of kin because he literally had nobody else. I thought with how bad he was that despite whatever went down, the mother would show up, but even she refused. His dad sent well wishes via phone call, but also refused to see him. And I began to wonder how bad was it that they would not even come say what could very well be their goodbyes. After he confessed what he had done to his sister, I cut all ties with him. Reminded me of the saying, a drunk mind speaks sober thoughts. He had groped me whilst bending to put my shoes on, then tried to get behind me and strangle me with one arm, and I think he was trying to flip me around and tried to forcibly kiss me with snot all over his face. It was disgusting, and I still cannot get the memory out of my mind. I planned to cut all ties with him then anyway, but the confession about his little sister was the final puzzle piece where everything clicked and just fell into place.